All right, folks. Well, good morning, good afternoon, maybe good evening for you, and welcome to the 11th episode of The Deliberate Way. I'm Dan Seewald, your host, and I'm really excited about what we have going on here today. We're almost on a dozen episodes, and as we kind of get to that precipice, I could think of nobody better than to bring on and to talk about this is Craig Lipset. Craig, we're going to be talking about the freakonomics of clinical trials. And I got to tell you, it's a topic which super fascinates me. Now, I know not everybody who works in life sciences or pharmaceuticals thinks about this day in and day out, like maybe like you do. But I'll tell you, this topic is so relevant, so personal. I can't wait to dive deep into it. And I'm going to share a little more background about you. But Craig, big thanks for being here and joining.
Dan, I'm such a fan of your work. It is absolutely a pleasure to be here with you. I'm looking forward to today's conversation. Let's go.
All right. Well, Craig, for the people who don't know you that well, I'm going to give a real quick capsule of this is your life, Craig Lipset. Craig and I met many years ago while we were both working at Pfizer. And at that time, you may remember, Craig, you were the head of clinical innovation and venture partner at Pfizer. And since you departed Pfizer, you've been running a really cool little boutique advisory business called Clinical Innovation Partners, where you work with executive teams, with startups, boards of directors. You really do some awesome stuff there. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that one of the topics that's near and dear to your heart is the topic of decentralized trials. And you co-chair the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, as well as you speak on the topic a lot. You're a regular pundit. You advise people on it. It's kind of one of those things which not everybody thinks about, but you really are kind of a real deliberate innovator in this space. And I'll pour on the flattery just a little bit more, Craig. When you're not doing all this stuff in industry and helping companies out, I hear that you're a regular speaker and a teacher at Rutgers and the University of Rochester. I don't know when you sleep. When do you sleep? Maybe
I'll
not
get to
much at
sleep.
all.
I'll get to sleep one of these days. But you know what, Dan? It's interesting. I was thinking about this when you were giving that overly flattering intro. I was not a deliberate innovator when we did the first decentralized clinical trial at Pfizer so many years ago. And back then, I had this opportunity to help lead a team as we were scoping out what a fully decentralized clinical trial would look like, enabling people to participate entirely from home. A lot of that was just fueled by my own experiences as a patient, by a lot of the patients I was interacting with in my own journey, and bringing that back into work and looking for those opportunities. So it is interesting now to think about how innovation has become more deliberate. But like a lot of travelers in this space, I think I started off an accidental innovator, but then stuck around.
Yeah, well, accidental innovators are also great deliberate innovators, and sometimes it just takes time and experience. All right, well, Craig, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to ask you a personal question just to start things off, a little direct. So I apologize in advance for the directness of it. Clinical trials. Would you personally put your own child, son or daughter, into a industry sponsored clinical trial?
You're just jumping right in there, Dan.
I am jumping in. Yeah.
I have two kids. One of them does have a chronic medical condition he does take medication for and is well managed. So it is something that we certainly would have thought about when first managing his diagnosis. I think like a lot of parents and like a lot of families. And for us, it's always been about risk thresholds. And I think it's that way for a lot of patients and caregivers. Now, in our case, I think like a lot of families, if it's a story where we didn't have other treatment options, if this were a case where either we had exhausted every option available to us or sitting with our trusted provider, there just weren't any available options to otherwise consider. I think then, like a lot of families, we would go down that path. And in our case, like so many others, there are treatment options. And so that creates a very different bar, I think, for a lot of families to even consider a clinical trial, because there will be clinical trials that look to uplift us from existing treatments. But the bar for me to be willing to introduce one of my children into those trials, knowing that there's an existing treatment option, is extremely high. I really need that medicine to have been tested in adults, probably be approved in adults, and really become more a story of how do we dose an adult medicine better for kids than introducing something that's truly investigational and new in my child.
And when you think about people who are doing more investigational molecules right now and participate in those trials, what inveigles them? What motivates them to do that, knowing that the risk is higher because the uncertainty is higher? What have you found from your experience?
I think that a lot of the research in industry right now that does direct towards kids really goes after unmet needs. And so those are the ones in rare genetic conditions that are really looking at areas where the kids really don't have other treatment options. Outside of those where there's unmet needs, a lot of the trials today involving kids are really to fix the gaps that we have around dosing. We treat so many kids in healthcare as if they're small adults and dose them as if they're small adults, and we really don't have good evidence about what is the right dosing for a child. And so in that case, I might feel okay having my child be in that trial because I realize I'm informed, I'm kind of privileged enough to be aware and comfortable with the research literature to be able to come in and say, well, the status quo ain't that great, right? We're kind of guessing the right dose for him anyway. But again, that involves starting with folks with that right level of privilege of knowledge. And it's so hard for so many, especially with a sick child, to navigate to get there.
I'm gonna roll back and ask another very naive question. Thinking about clinical trials, having worked in industry for a while, having done projects around clinical trials, it should probably be pretty intuitive by this point for me, certainly for you. But when I look at clinical trials, the complexity sometimes feels almost inordinate. It's so complicated when you look at trials and the cost of them as well, for that matter. But thinking about the complexity of trials, they've come a long way. Why are they still so complicated? I think the first trial was in the 18th century, and modern trials go back almost 80 years. Why are they so darn hard? What's making them so difficult?
I ran this innovation conference for the clinical trial crowd for a couple of years. And when we first did it about 12 years ago, our mutual friend from Pfizer, Greg Simon, who ran policy, came and did the opening keynote. And Greg is fabulous. If folks don't know him, he ran the Biden Cancer Initiative for years. But he opened by sharing, you're never supposed to show up and talk about religion, politics, and death. But he opened by pointing out the first clinical trial was in the book of Daniel in the Bible, and pointed to the king of Babylon, identifying that the king at that time told his the men and the fighters, you shall only eat meat because that's how you'll stay strong. And there were a group that said, well, we kind of like vegetables. So he let some of those guys eat their vegetables for 10 days and then looked at them. And that was the end point, the king looking and saying, you look pretty healthy. And after 10 days of that cohort having a different diet, actually came to that conclusion. So not exactly randomized, but there was an intervention, a different diet, and there was an endpoint, what the king had to say about it. So yeah, I guess you could say we've been doing these experiments for quite a while. A lot of folks do point to I trained in epidemiology, and the James Lind story of scurvy is often pointed to as really the first randomized trial, where also about a dozen men on a ship endemic with scurvy, debilitating to the men, assigned different regimens to the different men, and kind of came back and said, well, which of the regimens seemed to prevent scurvy? And so some men were drinking cider, and some were drinking seawater, and a couple were eating oranges and lemons. And that's how we learned about the impact of citric fruit. But to get to your question about, well, we've been doing this then for maybe thousands of years, and certainly in the modern era,
I underestimated by a couple of millennia.
But even in the modern era, this is not a new concept. Why has this gotten so expensive, so burdensome, to the point that you really need to be an extremely well-capitalized company to develop a medicine? Even a university can't really do this on its own. It's hard for, say, a nonprofit organization to do this on its own. It's really so cost prohibitive. And why is that the case? We're talking about a controlled experiment, okay, introducing an intervention and having robust systems for patient safety and for data integrity, right? Those are the guardrails for clinical trials. We have to focus on safety and make sure that the people that are stepping forward and consenting to participate are protected. And we have to have confidence in the data. And everything else, theoretically, we have some latitude around to be able to do it in better and smarter ways. I think that we have layered response to response to response to different issues over the decades and created a morass that becomes almost impossible to modify, incredibly difficult to innovate, and incredibly expensive. And it certainly leads many to wonder, what if we started with a blank slate? What if we started with a blank sheet of paper? Would it look anything the way it looks today? Especially when we're trying to layer research on top of an already dysfunctional healthcare system, right? Where people struggle, at least in the United States, struggle for access, struggle for affordability, struggle for information that they can trust. And now we're dropping research right on top of that. You know, look, it's not a bragging right in the United States that we've got one of the most expensive health systems on the planet and some of the lowest mortality rates among developed countries on the planet. And so dropping a research infrastructure on top of that, we kind of get what we get as a result.
You know, I'm going to kind of drill down a little further. When you mentioned about expensive, and we did call this the Freakonomics of clinical trials. And, you know, for those who are not familiar with the work of Dubner, Levitt, Freakonomics, some of the kind of the moral hazards, unexpected things that happen in the world of behavioral economics. Clinical trials, for me, are one of the interesting phenomena. We spend for between phase 1 to 4, from one source, about $60 million on a particular trial, on one trial. It's an enormous amount that's being spent. What's driving it? What are some of the kind of the moral hazards or freakonomic elements that make it expensive or that might surprise people, Craig?
You know, I love the book Freakonomics. I love the podcast Freakonomics. And then it was a couple of years, well, more than a few years ago, Todd Park was the chief technology officer for the Department of Health and Human Services in the U.S. And I saw him speak at an event, and he shared this perspective. He said, the U.S. healthcare system isn't broken. It operates exactly the way our misaligned economic incentives are set up for it to operate. And he went on with a number of examples, and I just sat there thinking to myself, the same is true for so much in clinical research. Are things truly broken, or do we just have a lot of misaligned economic incentives? You know, one example that I think many have become aware of and try to modify through creative contracting models has been our model of partnering with CROs, contract research organizations. And for those that aren't familiar with this field, CROs are now an essential partner to pharmaceutical and biotech companies in how they conduct and execute the studies. They're bringing a lot of the people and often the process as well to get the study to happen in terms of monitoring and oversight and handling of data. Now, traditionally, contracts between sponsors and a CRO were fueled by the number of sites, the number of months, the number of patients. These variables would drive the total contract value. And so all of a sudden, you had a vendor, a partner, who's financially incentivized based on complexity. You know, longer studies with lots of measurements were kind of good for the bottom line, theoretically, for a CRO. Now, fast forward to today, and a lot of sponsors now conduct more performance-based contracting models and try to take a little more shared risk with their CROs. But historically, there was a clearly misaligned economic incentive between a key vendor and a key source of cost for studies and the research sponsors themselves.
I'm going to ask you I guess, a harder question because it's going to ask you to draw upon what's been done well. So I've been pointing out trials are expensive, they're complicated. Would you put your own child in? I'm curious, what have people done well to fix some of these misalignments? Are there a couple of interesting examples that you've seen where an organization, an institution, a person for that matter, has seen this misalignment, some of the moral hazards even that lurk, and they did something to innovate around it? Any couple examples maybe that stand out for you, Craig?
So here's my favorite example for the year 2023. So one of the most significant misaligned economic incentives has to do with treating physicians, the doctors that are taking care of the patient. You know, in most cases, for a patient to learn about a clinical trial from the person they trust most, the doctor in their life, in order for that to happen, you need serendipity, that your doctor happens to be an investigator in the trial that happens to be right for you. And short of that, we have a health system in the United States that actually would disincentivize your doctor from talking to you about a clinical trial, because if they aren't the investigator, then they're probably sending you away to another provider. And in our country, in the US, providers are paid on doing work. They're paid based on RVUs, these relative value units that are based on the time they're spending with you. Sending you to another doctor in their field that happens to be across town, across the street, bad for business, misaligned economic incentive. Now, fast forward today, and there's actually some interesting fixes that are starting to emerge. So back in May, the FDA introduced draft guidance on decentralized clinical trials. A decentralized clinical trial, all this means is that we can enable the patient to participate in some of the visits outside of a traditional research site. Now, great. There was a lot of momentum around decentralizing research during the pandemic. As the pandemic receded and the FDA emergency guidance went away, the FDA was very quick to get this decentralized trials guidance out to the community. But they included in that guidance some really interesting language that we've never seen before. They talk about a role of the HCP, the healthcare provider, in a clinical trial. We've kind of historically ignored that this person exists. We talk about the participant, we talk about the investigator, but if you're a patient with a health condition, you have a doctor in your life, that HCP. And what the FDA did, which was very cool in this draft guidance, was they said, if there are routine care activities or routine care procedures that are happening in this study, then an ordinary HCP, not the study investigator, can perform those. Maybe it's a routine care blood draw. Maybe it's a routine care collection of physiologic data. There's really a host of things that might include. It could even, for a cancer trial, be the chemo, the routine care chemo that you might still be receiving. And what that did is it kind of fixed a broken incentive, because now that community physician doesn't have to send the patient away and lose revenue and have the misaligned incentive, but instead can keep the patient in their practice, keep treating them, and have them participate in research.
And it sounds like that's a pretty big disruption for kind of what's been done in the past. How did anybody resist this? Was someone trying to pull back the misalignment because it benefited them? Just out of curiosity.
It's a great question, right? Now, one would wonder, will existing investigators and investing in existing investigator sites embrace this, or does it provide some sort of fear or trepidation? Theoretically, some of the revenue of a routine care procedure that might have gone to a research site is now going to the treating physician, that community provider. But I think investigators are right when they're raising their hand saying, I still have a responsibility here in terms of oversight for the patient, data integrity, patient safety, and I have to be compensated fairly by the research sponsor for that work. And so it could result, if sponsors deploy this wrong, it will marginalize the investigator. It'll make them feel like their cheese is getting moved and that money is being taken from them to be given to the HCP, when in fact maybe some revenue is. But we as sponsors need to make sure we're keeping those investigators whole for the responsibilities that they do retain around oversight of the data and oversight of these interactions. Dan, the FDA's comment period closed on the draft guidance. I think they received close to 900 comments from the public on that draft guidance, and a lot of them lean in on this very topic. So I know the regulators are very busy consuming that feedback and making this guidance even stronger.
Now, I know that just a little bit of a pivot, that the work being done right now and the feedback commentary from the FDA and the public is not done in a vacuum of what else is happening in the world. And there's no doubt that you're seeing what I see and what many other people are seeing around the explosion around artificial intelligence, generative AI, ChatGPT, but other forms of AI. How does that play into the future of clinical trials? There's something that I came across called digital twinning, which I had no idea what that was. And for those who don't, because I think most people won't, it's this idea of having a virtual representation of yourself based on your historical genetic and health data. And they'd have that person theoretically go through in real time through a clinical trial. And they would use that in exchange or in substitution of a real human being. How is AI coming to play? Are things like this, which feel really futuristic and actually even a little worrisome at times, are they going to change, or are they changing the game already for clinical trials?
I think it's a great question, and it certainly gets a lot of attention today, because even at a time when industry seems to be contracting, there's a lot of downsizing, there's carving back of IT budgets within a lot of large pharma right now, and our biotech allies out there are struggling as well in terms of funding and financing in the current economic environment. But we still see a lot of interest and momentum around exploring many of these AI use cases in clinical research and clinical trials. Some of them we've actually been doing for a number of years, and others are a little more new. To me, when we think about AI in clinical trials, it starts up front in portfolio decisions and study designs, spaces where we're consuming a lot of different data and could use a little assistant by our side when we're making decisions based on all of that diverse data. We can start to see AI come in around study conduct, helping us with predictive analytics around quality and oversight for patient safety and data integrity as data is coming in, and being able to trigger different clues for study teams to be able to intervene earlier. And certainly AI comes in when we think about digital measurements, those that wave of new connected devices, sensors, wearables, and otherwise. How can AI start to enable us to have a next generation of ways to measure change with patients? We also see a lot of AI today around just automating things. Can we automate data entry by pulling data from EMRs? Can we automate writing of things with generative AI? But you hit on one of my favorite AI use cases around digital twins. And it's my favorite because I think it really is one of the most disruptive, right? When you think about all of the stakeholders involved in clinical research today, and many of them, there is some future of obsolescence, right? Like maybe we don't need this provider or that type of tool in the future. The one stakeholder that kind of would embrace obsolescence are patients in trials. There's no patient that aspires to be in a clinical trial. If they're there out of need, urgency, necessity.
Do you see this realistic? Is this what's there's your gut reaction, and then there's the logical brain kicking in. Well, answer from both of those perspectives. What do you think is that?
I think it's very realistic. And I think we're seeing incredibly progressive positions from regulators in both Europe as well as the US around these approaches. A lot of the early momentum has started in the neurosciences, looking at Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and other conditions. And now we're starting to see these approaches start to pull over into other therapeutic areas. The basic story is, if I had access to Dan Seewald's historical medical data as well as the medical data of other people with that medical condition, could I enroll Dan in the trial and introduce an intervention while at the same time having a machine created instance of Dan continue in the trial, maybe in the control arm for the trial? And this idea of having a digital twin, it may seem radical and new in this context, but digital twins have been used in aerospace and automotive industries for years. So it's a very exciting field. There is a lot of evidence for using digital twins outside of life sciences and clinical trials. The receptivity so far has really been remarkable. And what's really fun here, Dan, is for sponsors in this space, there's kind of a low risk way to build some chops, to build some learning, right? You run your clinical trial the way you were going to, right? Enrolling people in both the active and the control arm. And then in the background, you can run like a digital twin arm and kind of use that as your learning and experimentation. No risk to your study design, right? But I'll tell you the risk on my mind about digital twins is my health data is just so accessible, right? You can go into different data aggregated, well, not you as an individual, your organization may be purchasing aggregated, de-identified health data and using clever ways to link data across different sources. Is it possible that my digital twin is getting enrolled into a clinical trial right now without my knowledge? Is it possible that my digital twin is being enrolled in a study that actually I might not view favorably, right? Just as we know that there have been studies that have been designed, say, studying medical conditions among Native American populations that were actually viewed as very hostile to those patient communities. Should I always have a say and provide consent if my digital twin is going to be used in someone else's research?
I mean, there's so many points that you brought up, and I mean, great insight on this, Craig. And so I'm going to just note, folks, you can ask questions. I know people are actually pouring questions in now. Some people have actually directly messaged me. So we have a few that are coming in. So feel free, put those into the chat and on LinkedIn, and we'll bring those up. But before I cede control to the audience, I have to ask, just on this point around AI, it would seem almost intuitive that it should drive down the cost of clinical trials. But I could see where you see an inversion, sort of the Levitt and Dubner-esque view on like the kind of the unintended consequences of new technology that could drive it up and create more expense, more complexity because AI is new and sexy. There should be a premium on it. What's your take? Will it actually end up drive up the cost of trials? Or do you think, in the medium term, at least, it might drive them down?
We when we add innovation and add innovative approaches into our trials, we add cost. The only time that we can actually start to realize a cost savings is when we commit and start to reduce some of the existing bloat in our trials. And that can be scary for organizations. If we are just going to add a third arm in our trial with my digital twin enrolled, we're adding cost. We will reduce cost when we're willing to burn the boats and not enroll a human control in that study, or enroll fewer human control humans into the control arm of that study. That's scary. That is a big step in terms of commitment.
It is.
It has perceived risk, but that's where we get the return.
Yeah, I'll just thinking about like with new startup ventures, companies that are getting large valuations, there's a lot of investment capital that's being pumped in. There's got to be an expectation from those who are funding new and kind of curious and adventurous startups. They're going to get a return. That return's got to come from somewhere. So I wonder your perspective. Like, is it a blossoming industry, kind of like AI and new tech and clinical trials, or will it sort of kind of create a reduction that you might see?
Well, I think, fortunately, in the case with digital twins, there are some other use cases besides just the big ambition, the big impact of reducing the number of patients in a control arm. You can use those digital twins to improve your study design, your planning, your modeling of a trial beforehand. So there are some quicker wins that may not have quite
The
that
more
lofty
tactical,
ROI.
immediate application. Yeah.
Exactly. So that you don't have to just, wait for the big bump, right? Reducing the number of patients in a trial should clearly bring a nice cost savings, as well as be viewed favorably by patients having fewer randomized to be in a control arm. Are there unintended consequences? We still have to be able to access people's data, and we should be doing that in ways that have permissions attached. Now, those that know me know I actually am also a believer that if you are going to use my way in a data that is commercial, if you're going to use my data in a way that drives some sort of commercial venture, then I should be able to participate in that upside if you're using my data. And so what's an unintended consequence? Well, maybe we're going to only catalyze futures, which are not bad futures, where those people whose data we're using today so easily, maybe we need to be licensing that data from me in order to
Wow.
use it to
Almost like
train
with
your
college
models.
athletes, you're licensing their likeness, they're able to benefit. I mean, if somebody individually contributes to the next big breakthrough, should they not be enriched for taking that risk? Very interesting propositions. I like where you're going with this. I'm going to ask one and a half more questions. Half a question. That's my way of being non-committal to give you a quick one on this. When you think about diversity in clinical trials, that's been one of the hot issues that, because as just a matter of course, you don't have that representation. You kind of alluded to it before, Native American populations, other minority groups that have been hesitant to participate. How does that potentially kind of play in today of being able to kind of creatively address that? Knowing that there are some disincentives out there, there's also some incentives that are being built in to be able to bring a more representative population in your studies. Your thoughts on that?
This has been an important question for years, and I think in the post George Floyd era of increased awareness, appreciation, and investment in social justice concerns, I think has only helped to put an even larger spotlight on the gaps in knowledge about which treatments work for which patients and which populations. And if our studies just enroll a bunch of people that look like me, then our evidence is primarily about people like me. And so how do we help to improve representation in our studies so that the people enrolled in the study look like the people to whom the drug will ultimately be prescribed? So one other great action from the FDA this past year, a mandate around diversity action plans, the requirement that for most late phase studies that there is a plan in place to drive diversity. Now, some people misconstrue this. Some people say the FDA is mandating diversity. The FDA is mandating a diversity plan. And like my grandmother used to say, a young girl plans and God laughs. We make plans, but they don't always come to fruition. There are no carrots and sticks attached to these plans. The guidance from the FDA goes only so far in pointing out that if you have a plan and do not realize its targets, you'll have to work back with your review team and may have to do some post-marketing commitments. And that's not really a good answer, because what that means is we do our robust clinical trial and generate great evidence for people like me. And then we have a second tier of evidence, maybe using real world data for people of color or other communities that are not being properly represented. And so this kind of goes back to our Freakonomics story, Dan, because we've figured out how to drive the right incentives when we look at rare disease research or pediatric research. We've created incentive schemes and through legislation and policy that can extend exclusivity when drug developers do certain things. And now as a result, rare disease drug development is a robust industry. With the right incentives in place, I really think a lot of this problem is addressable because there are some great tactics and strategies out there. They just need the right commitment behind them.
And I have so many other questions I want to ask you, Craig, but in all fairness, I did say I would take questions from the group. I'm going to just lob a few over in your direction. Are you ready for them?
Bring it.
All right. So the first question that came up was, do we see a difference in physicians referring patients to clinical trials in health systems with different economic incentives. For example, the UK's NHS or the PMDA in Japan.
I think this is a fabulous question, right? It's hard to just generalize about the state of referrals and some of the barriers that we see. And as this questioner rightly points out, our US system of RVUs and how we pay for providers is very different from what we see in many other countries where physicians may just be working on a salary as a part of a health system. You know, the other kind of interesting lines for us in this country, we have physicians that are often employed by specific health systems. So if you look at, say, a street corner in California, you might have one doctor on one side of the street that works for Kaiser and look diagonally, and that doc works for Scripps, and look across the street and that doc works for Sharp. Are they more incentivized to stimulate referrals within their health system because that health system has come to appreciate that the patient is still staying within and can create the proper incentives? I think another interesting example that we can start to consider in the US that takes a page from maybe how health systems work outside the US is in the US when we look at federally qualified health centers, FQHCs, which are the safety net infrastructure for healthcare in the US. Again, here these providers tend often to be salaried, not all the time, but in many of those FQHCs. And so it's a great point that we can often have a little more momentum around stimulating referrals, at least around the Freakonomic, the misaligned economic incentives. There are still other emotional barriers that can often stand in the way of stimulating a referral. For research participation, there can be emotional barriers around feeling like I'm not, for some reason, capable of providing adequate care for this patient, that I need to send them not to a specialist, but to a peer of mine that just happens to be an investigator in the study. But that's often less of an issue than some of these other barriers. So it's a great point to keep us looking at the systems outside of the United States.
There is another question, Craig, that asked, should we not consider having all trials centralized through government entities or quasi-government entities rather than leaving it to the auspices of individual companies?
It is
that. That's a pretty that may even get to the political realm of sort of decentralizing or federalist and non-federalist, but yeah, do share thoughts about that.
I wish I could say that studies run by the NIH are radically more efficient or more organized than those in the private sector, but I don't think we have enough evidence to say that there is such a dramatic difference. Sometimes the private companies are able to deploy more capital than the federal government can through their grant models with the NIH and others to be able to drive a development program more aggressively. If you look, for example, at the COVID vaccine trials, Pfizer funded their study entirely on their own. Moderna's was heavily supported by the federal government. They kind of both started and ended right around the same time with right around the same number of patients. And so there really wasn't an obvious winner in that race. But I'll give you two clues of who may be interesting places, where there may be some interesting new places to place some bets. One might be on nonprofits in this space. Now, I said earlier that it's hard for nonprofits to support drug development because of the cost, but we are seeing more and more ways that clinical research is getting democratized. The cost of accessing these technologies are getting far more accessible. There are some very interesting examples of where organized patient groups and nonprofits have been able to carry a molecule very far, and now we see groups emerging like out of Penn, where Every Cure is a really interesting nonprofit to keep an eye on, primarily focusing on drug repurposing using AI and vast amounts of data, but then also leaned into smarter ways to test and generate evidence about those medicines. I think another clue for the audience as we think about, okay, if it's not going to be government and it's not going to be pharma, how else will we drive more efficiency? Well, in Europe, we saw the role of platform trials and master protocols during the pandemic. And what's great about this type of study is, one of the reasons why drug development is so expensive is we're deploying a huge amount of infrastructure just for one trial to answer one question about one drug in one patient population. It's like we're stringing up all of this phone wire all around the country to make one phone call, and then at the end we cut it and we break it all down. And what these platform trials let us do is test multiple drugs or potentially multiple indications in one reusable trial infrastructure of sites and recruitment efforts and data.
And who sponsors that, or who's leading the charge on that?
Well, that is where it gets interesting, right? Very often you need some entity to be the neutral convener to bring these groups together. Very often so far, it's been advocacy and nonprofit groups that are sort of bringing groups together. The government has also played a substantial role there. And then pharma tends to come in as a partner in the process. And so I think that this type of collaborative research is definitely a key part of our future of making research far more efficient.
I have to ask you, I think it was a number of years ago, was it Patients Like Me, which patients actually self-organized their own trial without any other, or I don't know if there was much interdiction into the design, but do you recall that? And why is that relevant even now, do you think?
So for folks that weren't familiar back then, Patients Like Me was one of the very early examples of patients in an online community that were actively sharing data about themselves and their health condition, the medicines and other interventions they tried, and what outcomes they were seeing. And a heavy density in that community of patients with ALS. Now, there was a very small study that got published, I think it was out of Italy, that suggested that patients taking lithium had better outcomes with ALS. And faster than any investigator could submit a grant request, get funded, and design a trial, a group of patients there started to self-experiment and organize themselves and found ways to share data to answer this question, where some of them started to take lithium and others didn't. And that crowd of patients generated evidence months before any proper clinical trial with an investigator got off the ground. When those investigators finally got their processes in place and were able to run a study, they came up with the same answer. It doesn't work.
Wow.
So it's fascinating to see, again, the power of organized patients using democratized tools that once upon a time were really almost impossible to access. But today, organized patients can find each other and share data in structured ways.
One more question that came in, Craig, and then we're going to play our final speed round of boom or bust. So get ready for that. But before that, there was a question going back to AI that was asked. Who's going to be policing and overseeing artificial intelligence when morals and ethics could be in question? Now, I'm going to interpret that a little bit, that perhaps sometimes the people who are hosting a trial may have different incentives than just pure science and about outcomes, but I could be wrong. Your reaction to that question?
This is such an important question for us right now, right? We can look at, are there examples of other spaces? I have a friend on LinkedIn, Richie Atoir, who publishes very often on this topic, that perhaps we need almost like we have, other public scales for me to monitor my credit report or other forms of transparency. Do we need rating scales for the public to be able to understand how an AI algorithm was developed? What was the diversity and representation of the data? How do I have trust and confidence in these tools? And depending on when this drops for your viewers, there was very recent activity in the White House here in the US with the president taking some action and starting down this process in this country. But I appreciate that this is a really challenging question that's being raised. one could try to police themselves, whether within a specific vertical, as an industry, as a country, but in a very global and connected space. That doesn't stop malintended tools from getting developed in other
Absolutely.
pockets of the world.
And actually, I would refer anyone to listen to S. Matthew Lau from New York University. We had him on in a previous episode talking about the ethics of AI, and the notion of clinical trials did come up, and it's a whole nother topic for more than an hour. There was one more question that was slipped in, Craig, that I just want to throw out because I think it's a really good one. The last few years have been sort of focused on decentral trials to diversity. What do you think the next big thing is? What's the next big topic that's on the horizon?
It is true that our industry definitely gravitates to something else every couple of years. We are very cyclic, and if you think about the meme of the guy walking with his girlfriend, and there's another girl in a red dress walking by, who's getting his attention? It probably is AI right now, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think what our industry, what our community needs to get better at doing is finishing what we started. And that doesn't mean that we can't do both at the same time. It doesn't mean wait on all things AI until we've addressed diversity, right? We can do more than one thing at a time. It's just this year is making it a little harder than normal to do that as we're swinging towards smaller organizations, leaner organizations. I think the real challenge for us isn't what's the next shiny object. It's how do we maintain existing progress while starting to identify details around that object.
I love your point on that. It is so hard. And we know, like, atomic habits, the power of behaviors, it is so hard to see things through. It's easy to be attracted to that next shiny object, but seeing it through and doing it in parallel on the next big thing, that's tricky because you need more people, more resources. Well, we could talk more about this, but it's time, Craig, to talk about booms and busts. Now, just to give some quick context, I've selected at semi-random a number of emerging or new technologies that are being used in clinical trials or adjacent to clinical trials even. And I'm going to ask you, Craig, your reaction. Do you think this will be a boom, next big thing, or it'll be a bust? The air is let out. It doesn't really have a big or substantive impact for the betterment of trials. You ready?
All right, let's go.
All right. I'll give you like 30 seconds to 45 seconds just to elaborate on your answer also, because I do want to know what you think other than just your answer. All right, first one. The retail pharmacy model in clinical trials. The retail pharmacy model in clinical trials. Boom or bust?
I have to unfortunately say it's a near-term bust, mostly because I think it's just taking time to get the right players in the right spaces. It's very hard for these large, massive chains and organizations where clinical research is kind of a small business for them. And so where does this fit within a CVS? Will it remain of interest inside of a Walmart? I think that there is a huge amount of potential in terms of those locations playing an impact. I think that over the long term, I think this is going to be real, but in the near term, it's still a little bit lumpy. And fortunately, we still have a couple of players like Walgreens that are committed, and fortunately, a number of sponsors that are still trying to learn and make that work. I'm looking forward to seeing more success stories.
Yeah, I still recall the excitement of the Minute Clinic and how it was going to revolutionize primary care, and it hasn't quite yet. So maybe a bust. I'm with you. I'm voting with you on that. All right, next one, Craig. Blockchain. That's kind of a big beast. Blockchain. Is that going to revolutionize clinical trials or partially revolutionize clinical trials? Is that a boom or a bust?
There's some use cases around blockchain that I really love. In general, I'm going to call blockchain a bust, and I'm going to call it a bust because I think
wasn't expecting that.
Well, I think that it's a space where some really hardcore evangelists around the technology ran around too much, just trying to fit blockchain in everywhere. Here is a blockchain enabled X or a blockchain enabled Y. And we would look at it and say, well, why did that have to go in a blockchain? Just because it could, did that actually solve a problem? Now, there are some really good use cases for blockchain around data ownership, around data, around traceability of data back to individuals. And some of it is going to link right back to what we were talking about earlier: transparency, permission, awareness, maybe even participation if my data is being monetized. I love blockchain for that. Blockchain overall, I don't think is going to be game changing, but blockchain for some very specific and interesting opportunities, I'm all in.
All right. It's often people see it as a solution in search of problems, which there's nothing wrong with, but you got to find those problems. Sounds like there's still some miles to go. Here's one that sounds very buzzwordy, and I'm going to throw it out to you. Maybe you could even explain what it means. Clinical trial tokenization. What the heck is that? And is that a bust?
It's funny to hear it like right after blockchain, because very often I think when people hear token, they think a blockchain token like Bitcoin. But in this case, when we talk about a trial token, the idea here is we can protect people's privacy, but we can still connect their data across different data sets where they're otherwise de-identified and anonymous. So maybe there's an aggregated data about electronic health records here, and maybe there's an aggregated data that's also de-identified with consumer purchases over there. How can I link those with a privacy preserving token? Now, what I love about this, so I'm going to call this a win. I'm going to call this a boom. And I'm going to call it a boom because this is one of our key solutions for being able to bring more real world data into clinical trials, right? The data, whether from EMRs, from claims, from other sources, because we can connect it. We can take data that's otherwise de-identified and connect it to a patient in my trial. And what I love about it is we do it in a permissioned way. This isn't a creepy behind the scenes trolling through your data. This is with informed consent, with an engaged patient giving permission for their data to be connected. So let's make that a boom.
All right. You're duly noted. It's a boom. All right. This is one I'm actually really interested in. Corporate data collectives, or in other words, when large pharmaceutical companies or other life science companies will pull their data together and then make it available to everyone in that collective. And I'll just note, you said something, I love your metaphor about, putting up the wires for one phone call. It's such a great metaphor. Is this the solution to that one phone call wiring system? And is it a boom or bust, by the way?
I will give it a conditional boom, because there is a step that's missing from some of those data sharing collaboratives that I think will make them realize their full potential. So these data sharing collaborations, some of them are really potent. Within Transcelerate, which is a nonprofit organization of pharmaceutical companies, there's an initiative called Datacelerate. And one of the seed studies from that actually are some of our friends at Pfizer had gotten off the ground originally. How can we share data from the control arms of our trials, right? They don't reveal anything about our investigational medicine. It's just really good structured data that should be doing more good in the ecosystem and getting reused. Now, the one last step that's missing to make that a boom is it can't just be among the club of big organizations that put data in. How do we enable academic researchers and the broader research community to fully leverage that data? And that's when it's going to create boom worthiness, right? It's so it's clean, it's organized, it's structured. It's a beautiful data set that we create from our research studies to reuse. We just have to open it up to really let the vast research community take advantage.
I mean, it sounds like truly creating an ecosystem where multiple entities can plug into it. I
agree. And there's gateways we've already created as an industry. Look at Vivly as a great example of an infrastructure that the industry and academia have worked together to create, to give us a secure kind of gateway that researchers can come in and access vast amounts of data. We need to open up more of that.
All right, penultimate one, Craig, is N of 1 individualized genomic trials. Is that going to be a boom or a bust, or maybe somewhere in between, actually? Your thoughts?
I love, as we said earlier, that so many research tools are democratized and available for individuals. I don't really know where true N of 1 is going to go in terms of really being maximally impactful. So I'm going to call N of 1 a bust. And this is a term I'm just making up right now with your question, Dan. I'm going to go with N of some. So instead of just N of 1, how do we find some other people that are like me and use those platforms to generate research data together, right? And use those same high quality tools and diverse data so that it's more than just one, but now I'm with others and I can create that impact of N of some in a very democratized way. And I really think that N of some is going to be boom worthy. I think that that's going to start to show us how crowds of people could become the next pharmaceutical company.
I love the N of some. I haven't heard that before, so you better quickly run out and get a copyright on that one.
Yeah, I'm going to go grab the domain first thing.
Yeah, exactly. Someone already did as you were talking.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Last one, which is very connected to the previous, is the idea of biohacking. And I remember talking to a couple of NIH researchers about biohackers that were paving the way to give insight, research of stuff they haven't done by doing some biohacking. Thoughts on that? Is that a boom as a movement, or is that a bust? And is that have any impact at all in trials from your perspective?
I think that hardcore biohacking is a bust, and some of it can get a little dangerous and reckless. I think that there's things that people in garages have tried doing with CRISPR and with themselves that can be absolutely terrifying, right? But do you need an ethics committee and an IRB oversight if I am screwing around in my garage and injecting myself? I mean, this is an autonomous ecosystem, and I should be empowered to do the things that I think are right for me as long as I'm properly informed. But I think that the biohacking movement is really the seed of crowds of people democratizing research, and I think it is absolutely the boom that that this industry needs. It will keep industry on its toes. It will keep industry honest. It will apply positive pressure for industry because crowds of people can start to do the types of research that we've typically relied on industry to deliver, and people, patients, don't have to wait anymore, right? They don't have to sit idly by and hope and pray that pharma takes notice in their disease. There's more and more opportunities for them to be empowered and start to work together. Now, again, that doesn't mean hopefully to just go ordering supplies on the internet and whipping up something in your blender at home, but to answer other types of research questions in a democratized way, I'm all in.
Wow. I mean, I am ready to go down to my garage a little after 1 o'clock and do a little bit of gene editing. But that's great. I appreciate your input on that and all of the boom and bust. Craig, we just have a couple of minutes, so I want to kind of land on one last thing. The name of the podcast is called The Deliberate Way. And I use that term not just as some catchphrase, really do believe that the greatest innovators, the greatest minds are very systematic or deliberate in how they do things. You're a very deliberate person in what you do also. If you were to give some advice, 2 or 3 tips to somebody who is maybe entering the space of clinical trials or has been working for a little while in the space of clinical trials, it needs to be a bit more deliberate in how they innovate in this space. What couple of tidbits of advice or recommendations might you give to them?
The friend who hired me first at Pfizer gave me this one piece of advice. He said, never put the word innovation on your business card. And I think what he meant by that was, yeah, exactly, right? Clearly you and I defied that and we outlasted him. But I think the message there is that there are folks that will look at it and say, well, I innovate too. Don't we all innovate? Are you suggesting that you do innovation, and then what does that mean that I do? And I think we have to keep reminding folks that just as you're doing here every day, Dan, that innovation is a process. It requires attention and focus. It's not random. That's not how we necessarily create innovation. We have to to, as you say in your name, it is deliberate, it's intentional, and there are proven processes to help make that work. If you have innovation on your title in your organization, you're not there to be the innovator. You're there to empower others by helping them to understand and bring process and deliberateness to the way to the opportunities in front of them.
I love that. That is a great recommendation. And I'm looking at the time, and we are out of time, Craig. We are out of time. But first things first, Craig, I want to say big thank you to you for your wisdom, your sharing, your stories and examples. It was amazing. And then secondly, we will catch you guys on the bounce for our next episode of The Deliberate Way. We'll be coming back in the next few weeks with another exciting topic. But in the meanwhile, check out Craig. You could be one of many, the legion that follow Craig on LinkedIn. Reach out, and we'll have replays and videos. If you like the specific segments, they'll be out there for you. And once again, Craig, big thank you from me and from all of our listeners and viewers. So thanks again, Craig.
Thank you, Dan, for these great conversations.
Awesome. All right. With that, over and out, and we will see you all at the next episode or the next time we talk about deliberate innovation. Take care, everyone.